Hello, this is part one of my Mandalorian costume build. In this video I'll be making the helmet. Before we get started, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the little notification bell, especially if you want to build the whole costume, as that will make you aware of when future videos are put up tackling the rest of the armour. Done that? Cool. Well, let's get cracking. So we start off with the templates. These are printed on A4 paper and cut out with a pair of scissors. The part that makes the back of the head needs to be stuck together, as that's in two pieces. And the foam we're going to be using is 10mm thick EVA foam, and these are just floor mats. This part here that makes up the face is going to be drawn around and then flipped over and then drawn around again to be the other side. I've used a ruler to get that top edge nice and straight. I just use the back of a knife to draw around my pieces, as a Sharpie sometimes bleeds through the paint. Using a really sharp knife now to cut all the parts out. The bit here that would be the visor, I keep that for later. So these are the bits that make up the face and the back of the head. We're not going to tackle the dome just yet. Before we can assemble these bits, where the visor is going to go, you need to cut a channel in the back of the face. So I cut halfway down from the back and then halfway into the bit that goes around the visor, and then pull that part out. And you'll have a channel that looks like this, and you do that around the whole inside edge. Your knife needs to be extremely sharp to get a nice clean cut on this bit. Then using a heat gun to heat form the part that makes the back of the helmet. Just be careful when handling hot foam, as it's really easy to burn your fingers. And doing the same thing with the face part here, heat forming that too to get that nice and curved. And then using hot glue to glue the back on. And some tape that I've already pre-cut and stuck to the edge of my table to get that to sit nice and flush. You could of course use contact adhesive if you prefer, but I just love my glue gun. This is that visor piece we cut out earlier, just taping that back in now just to help the whole thing hold its shape a bit better. I've now taped in a part of the cheek. I've made sure I taped up the whole seam, and I'm gluing this from the back and folding that in. I've had to cut bevels on these pieces to make sure that they sit at the correct angles. This is me cutting a bevel in the back of one of the other cheek pieces. I just hold this on the edge of a table and use a really sharp knife to cut an angle into the back side of the foam. Heat forming this as it's slightly curved. And then that's also taped into place, making sure to cover the whole seam. As I'm gluing this from the back, I don't want any glue to seep through to the front face of the mask. This is the third cheek piece. This is done the same way, heat formed, bent into shape and taped into place. Some of these parts are easy to do a bit at a time, so do the back edge of this first, tape it in, glue it into place. Once that glue is completely set, then go ahead and do the other side of it. Just make sure you take your time with these parts, as they're on the front side of the helmet, and these are the bits that people are going to see the most. Now I've turned this upside down. You can see that it's not sitting completely flat to my table, and that's going to cause a problem when we come to stick the dome on. So to fix this, you're going to want to heat gun the inside, make sure you haven't taken any of that tape off, and then push down on it on a flat surface like your table, and then it will sit nice and flat like this. So onto the dome pieces. These parts are cut out as well out of 10mm EVA foam. They're cut out completely straight, no bevels needed for these. Make sure you remember which bits are which and which way up they go, and I've marked mine with a bit of tape and then written on those. And then use the heat gun and then bend these into shape. I first bent these over the corner of my table before I did them by hand, and then these are glued together a little bit at a time. I didn't do any more than about 2 or 3 inches of the seam before I let that completely set, and then moved on to the next 2 or 3 inches because I wanted to get this as smooth and seamless as possible. Once you've done the two halves, those two halves are then stuck together in exactly the same way. Doing a little bit at a time to make sure you can get that as neat as possible. This dome is then heat formed into shape, heat gun on the inside, and then using a bit of foam so you don't burn your fingers to push that out so it's a nice uniform curve. It is then glued to the rest of the helmet. From forwards of the ears it is set back slightly, but behind the ears it sits completely flush with the rest of the helmet. Heat forming and bending as you go. Now onto the detail pieces. These parts here are all cut out of 10mm foam and then are skinnied down to different thicknesses. Now I didn't have any skinnier foams, I had to kind of fillet these as if I'm filleting a fish, but if you've got the right thickness foam then that will be a hell of a lot easier. Each part is marked on it how thick it needs to be. So this is the lower part of the side detail. This is a triangle piece that's been cut out. That is then had a bevel cut into it and then glued back into place. So that will then create an angle. These parts here are cut out of 2mm craft foam. And then glued on top of the thicker counterparts. And then the detail bit in the middle added on afterwards. These little bits here that go on the back, they're also cut out of the 2mm craft foam. They're all exactly the same size except for one of them, which is cut down really thin. Parts are glued on the side with the big bit at the top and the thin bit in the middle and then the rectangular piece at the bottom. Just make sure you get them the right way round. These are the detail bits being glued to the back. So starting from the bottom and then you overlap them all the way up until you get to the top one, which needs to be cut down a bit thinner. Any hot glue that's seeped out you can just rub away with your finger. The friction from you rubbing will melt that slightly, meaning you can just rub that completely smooth. Last thing to do is the mohawk type thing up the middle. So a bit of foam cut down nice and thin, and then the edges are beveled. And then a rectangle piece is cut out, and that's to be stuck down the middle. The thickness of this piece is exactly the same thickness as the detailed channel on the front. The detailed channel on the front is scored lightly with a sharp knife. When you go over this later with a heat gun, that will open up that mark. So heating this from the back and then curving it to the right shape to fit the helmet. That's got to be curved inwards and to wrap around the helmet too. Before that can be glued on, a detail line needs to be cut into the brow of the helmet. I marked this by using a piece of electrical tape, score the line where it needs to go, and using a very sharp knife I'll cut a V-shaped groove into it. So cutting from one way and then the other way to cut a V-shaped channel into the foam. Your knife needs to be extremely sharp to get this to look nice and clean. So now gluing that mohawk type piece on, starting with the front, make sure you get that nice and centered. And then as before, doing a bit at a time, no more than a few inches at a time, and then gradually working your way back. as this foam is thicker than the Beskar steel would really be, I'm beveling the bottom edge of the helmet. The whole thing now needs to be heat sealed with a heat gun. And time to paint. I'm mixing black paint with silver paint, 3 parts silver to 1 part black. So using a small thin brush first of all to get into the inside of the visor and any areas where your big brush might struggle to reach. And once you've done that, move on to a bigger brush and just put a thin coat of that paint all over. Once that is completely dry, go ahead and do that all again till you've got 2 coats of paint. Then you'll notice that some of your seams might not be as nice as you'd hope, but we can fix that with some decorator's caulk. Make sure the stuff you get is paintable, otherwise your paint will just flake off. And you're going to squirt some of this out onto a bit of cardboard or a scrap piece of foam, and then using your finger to just apply that to any seams that you don't like the look of. Don't go too mad with this stuff, less is definitely more. And then once that's on, using a little bit of water and your finger again to smooth that out and just feather the edges. You can also use a rectangle piece of foam, almost like a squeegee, to get that stuff into the more hard to reach areas, like the gap between the mohawk piece I suppose and the rest of the helmet. Once that is completely dry, you can paint over it. I'll put another 2 coats of this silver and black mixed paint, and then once that's dry, the whole thing was covered with some clear automotive lacquer. Time for weathering. This is some light brown and a little bit of black paint mixed together with a bit of water. And then using that same brush to just dab that into the recessed areas, the places you think that dirt and grime might build up, and then using some tissue to just wipe that away. And then the bits in the recessed area will stay there. The angle that you rub this away is really important. You're going to want to rub away from the groove or the gap rather than into it, otherwise you'll rub away too much. Then use some black paint to just go into those detail bits on the ears. That's the weathering done. The whole thing has then been sealed again with some more automotive lacquer. Onto the visor. This is a Welding visor, and this is a shade 5-1. It's green, it looks black, but it's actually green, and it is perfectly fine. It doesn't look green when it's in the helmet, trust me. I'm using the part I cut out from the helmet to make my own template as I go, but you don't need to do this. The template is included with the rest of the templates. I'm then using some tin snips to cut this out. This has obviously got to be slightly oversized as it's going to fit into that recess we cut out earlier. The inside of this is then lightly sanded around the edges to help the glue stick a bit better. This is then bent into shape and pushed into the helmet, and that should sit nicely in that recess we cut out earlier. And then it's very gradually, like an inch or 2 at a time, glued into place. And here it is all finished. One completed Mandalorian helmet. There's a few bits of foam on the inside there, and that's just to stop it from wobbling around while you're wearing it. See? Because you don't want to look like a bobblehead or a pop figure. Visibility when you're wearing this is a lot like wearing sunglasses. Everything's slightly darker, and in this case tinted slightly green. But it's not too bad, you can still see perfectly well. People can't see into the visor and see your face through it. It's tinted enough to stop that. And no matter what angle you look at it or what light, it doesn't look green, even though the visor is green, so don't worry about that. I was a little bit sceptical when my visors arrived and they were green, but it looks black no matter which way you look at it, so that's pretty cool. The build itself was quite simple. The pattern is not very many pieces and is easy to put together. The hardest part though is definitely the fact that you're trying to replicate something made out of almost indestructible Beskar steel, which means there's not really any room for, oh, I screwed that bit up, that's going to be battle damage later, because it doesn't really take damage. It's, like I say, nearly indestructible. So you have to build this, I'd say take your time and get it as clean as you can get it, which is particularly difficult with this dome piece here. But I'm happy enough with this to move on to the next part of this costume build, which is going to be the rest of the Beskar armour. So that's going to comprise of the chest, the shoulders, the forearms and thighs. That's going to be done in a similar way, all out of EVA foam and in the same paint job and weathering technique. If you want to keep an eye out for that, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit the little notification bell as well, and you'll be notified when I post that video. In the meantime, if you want to build your own helmet, you can find the free templates for this over in the files section at the Facebook group, the Perfectly Imperfect Makers Community. There's a link to that in the description of this video down below. So yeah, if you don't want to spend thousands on someone else making you a Mandalorian costume, you don't have a 3D printer, but you do want to build one cheap and quickly, then this is the way. So yeah, that's it. Helmet done, on to the next bit. And remember, you don't have to be great at making to make something great. Bye bye.